Okay.
Today is April 26, 2007. We're doing an oral history interview for the archives at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. I'm Charles Lundquist. Our interviewee today is Carl Winkler. Carl, it's delighted to have you here today.
Pleased to be here.
We'd like to start out by asking you to tell us a little bit about your youth, where you went to school, and how you got into the space program. Can you do that, please?
I see. Okay. Well, first of all, I was born in Manchester, New Hampshire, and went to the local schools there, and I can remember quite vividly Pearl Harbor Day. I was a freshman in high school at that time, and things all changed after that. The following year, a lot of people my age, I was 14 at the time, a lot of people my age started to go to work after school. And I went to work as a meter reader for the Public Service Company. And growing up at that time, Grenier Field, which was located in Manchester, was a refueling stop for the B-24s. And they were just, the sky was just black with B-24s in 42 and 43. And then, of course, when I finished high school, I went to the University of New Hampshire, in Durham, New Hampshire. And
by then the war was over.
Well,
or nearly over.
Nearly over. What happened, I went into Durham, University of New Hampshire in September 45. Now, just weeks before, they had bombed Japan, and so that was kind of an exciting time. I remember VJ Day, and everybody from the city was out on the main street, and then I went down to the University of New Hampshire, and the veterans hadn't come back yet, so we were given a lot of attention, and I remember especially a chemistry course. Chemistry at my high school was kind of boring, and the teachers weren't very good. But we got into as freshmen in college. They had a senior professor, and he was up. I was amazed. He was up on the blackboard, showing these equations, describing how the atomic bomb worked, which just happened a few weeks before, and he was talking about critical mass and chain reactions, and it was an exciting time, and then along about December, the veterans started coming in, so they kind of dominated the thing when they came in. I found that they were the best students and also the worst students, and in the dormitories there were a certain group that wanted to just waste time and play cards and drink and everything, but they were also the best students. And so I went on through the University of New Hampshire and graduated in 49. And that was a time when it was hard to find a job. But a plum job for the electrical engineers was Westinghouse or GE.
So you had studied electrical engineering?
Yes, I was studying electrical engineering, right. And going back, I had continued to work for the Public Service Company, the power company, from the time I started in 1942 as a meter reader, and I worked for them continually. And in the summers, while I was at school, I worked in different. I had worked as at a hydroelectric plant one summer, and on electrical maintenance another summer. And
so you had some hands-on experience in electrical engineering.
Right. And so then when the interviews came, you know, I was kind of hoping that maybe I'd get an offer from one of these companies, but the veterans had so much more experience. They got most of the offers. However, I did get an offer from Alice Chalmers and from Milwaukee, and so I was I was the only one to get that offer, and I was pretty excited about it, and called my parents and told them I'd it looks like I would be going to Milwaukee. And there was silence. And then my mother came on the phone and she says, "We always thought you'd work for the public service." And so indeed, that's what I did. Public service hired 4 people out of that class, and I was one of them. And so I continued to work for the public service after graduating in '49 until in 1950. This is kind of interesting. In 1950, the Korean War started to heat up, and so my boss told me, called me in, and he was somebody that, even though he was the right age, he had never been in the service during World War II. And he said, "It looks like you might be subject to the draft." And he says, we have a few deferments, but he said, we have to save them for the more important people. And so I felt real patriotic at that moment, and I said, "Lee, I never asked for a deferment. I'm proud to go and serve my country." And that was the wrong thing to say. He turned red as a beet, and my assignments for the rest of my time there were menial. In fact, even dangerous. I got to working with a crew that was working on circuit breakers at substations, and we had to, first of all, pump all the oil out through a filter into barrels, and then actually go into these large circuit breakers and replace the contacts and clean up in there. And what we were using was a bucket of carbon tetrachloride and a rag to wring it out, you know, and clean it down in there.
Now, those were before the days.
Yeah, it was
about
right.
Carbon tet.
It was an excellent solvent. I have to get by that, but I was working with
also a little bit toxic.
Yeah, right. I found that out later on when I came down here, and at the time there was a fellow I was working with who was a World War I veteran, and he had a lot of trouble breathing, and he said, "This carbon tet is bad stuff." And I don't remember it bothering me too much, but it really bothered him. And so then I got my greeting from Harry Truman that your friends and neighbors have selected you and so forth, and that was in late 1950, and I was to report for a physical the day after New Year's, '51. So that happened, and then I had to, March the 1st, 1951 was, I actually was sworn in, and got on the bus and went to Fort Devens in Western Massachusetts for a reception center. I was there about a week, and we got all kinds of shots and things like that, and indoctrination into the Army. Then we went by bus to Fort Dix, New Jersey. And after 6 weeks at Fort Dix, they announced that they needed heavy weapons in Korea, and so we're going to have 8 more weeks of basic training and concentrating on heavy weapons. But before I get to that, back at Fort Devens, I thought it was kind of interesting. They were trying to interview me and where they would place me. This sergeant interviewed me, and he said, "When you worked for the power company, did you ever drive a truck?" And I said, "Small trucks." He said, "Well, they need truck drivers in Korea, so I'm going to put you down as truck driver." So then I was glad that I had to take those papers through the lieutenant before they were. He said, "You're a college graduate, right?" I said, "That's right." He scratched out. He said, "That's nonsense, that truck driver business." He says, "You should go in the S&P program." And I had never heard of an S&P program, and matter of fact, when we had our 50th anniversary down here, Dannenberg talked about how that S&P program got started, and it seems like, from what he said, that the German scientists, the rocket scientists, were located at Fort Bliss, and they were using some old hospital facilities, and then they started to need the hospital for casualties coming back from Korea, so they were looking for another place to locate, and Senator Sparkman, the way I understand it, had these buildings on Redstone Arsenal that he said would be available for that. So that's now it was kind of interesting when the company I was with in Fort Dix. Most of them didn't go to Korea. Most of them went to the occupation army in Europe, and a few of us weren't included. They said our orders would come in later. So after about 3 weeks, I got my orders to report to Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Oklahoma, and nobody had ever heard of Redstone Arsenal, so I was to proceed to the train station at Trenton and pick up my tickets and my meal tickets. So when I got there, everything was Alabama.
What year was that?
That was in 1951, in July of '51. So people were scurrying around to see whether it was Oklahoma or Alabama. And I said, well, I'm going to have to go to Alabama because that's where the tickets take me. So, and at that time I met Jim Kingsbury, and he was in a similar situation. However, his orders did say Alabama, so I felt confident that we were going the right place. So, he and I got on the train, and we went to we proceed to Chattanooga, and then spend the night in Chattanooga, and then proceed on Sunday morning, the 15th, into Huntsville. So when we reached Chattanooga, we stayed. I think rented cots in the YMCA across the street from the train station for I think 50 cents, and Jim said, "Let's go have a beer." So we went out and went to a place and had a beer. We met some local fellow that. In the conversation, he found out it was the first time in the South for both of us, and he said, "Well, I got to tell you about the Civil War," and so he said, "There's a lot of history here in Chattanooga," and so he took us for a ride, and we stopped at different places along the way and got refreshed, and we had quite an evening and got a lot of history lesson, and I'll never forget that. When I see Jim every once in a while, we talk about that time. And the fellow said that was called honky-tonking, and I had never heard that word either. But when I got to Huntsville, I found out that was something everybody knew about, honky-tonking. So let's see. We came into the train station, and taxi driver took us. He knew where to take us out to Redstone Arsenal. We met our first sergeant, Sergeant Barron, and he welcomed us to the place and said the next day we would get our assignment. So we had to report to Building 112. So Jim and I went to Building 112, and we were interviewed by Eric Neubert.
Oh, yes.
And he was a kind of a personnel man in those days, and he interviewed you to see what your background is, where you might best fit. And Jim went off to, I think they called it Plants Area 1, and I don't know who he talked to, but he ended up working with Dr. Lucas. But I was to see three people. I was to see Dr. Heusemann, Dr. Schlitt, and Dr. Stuhlinger. So I went first of all to Heusemann, and he showed me his guidance and control lab. And this was before transistors, so everything was with tubes. And he had racks and racks of electronics, and on the blackboard he was showing me all these equations that he was figuring out the coefficients for, and I was kind of overwhelmed with the whole thing. So he says, well, I'll take you next to Dr. Schlitt. And Dr. Schlitt said, can you design a servo mechanism? And I said, well, no. I said, that was graduate work where I went to school. There were people in graduate school who were doing that. He said, I don't need you.
That was Rudy Schlitt.
Huh?
That was Rudy Schlitt.
Yeah.
Rudolph Schlitt.
Yeah, I guess so, yeah. And so then the next one was Stuhlinger. And Stuhlinger had and you know, he had a real knack to talk about involved things and make them completely understandable, right? Go back to first principles and make them completely understandable. And I just, from the time talking to him, I really wanted to work there. And he said I'd be working with Dr. Manteuffel, who was, he was on leave at the time, but he'd be back in a few days. So, and he was working, he was a magnetic amplifiers expert. So he's working on mixing computer for the guidance system. And he had breadboards out there, and he was, Dr. Manteuffel was a kind of a rotund figure. He was way overweight, and he smoked 7 to 10 cigars a day and had a wonderful German accent and a friendly guy. And we got along well together. And however, there were a few things that we get located in. At that time, there were 4 GIs and 4 German doctors in Stuhlinger's research section.
Quite a combination.
Yeah, Clark Lemley worked for Stuhlinger mostly, and I worked for Manteuffel, and Fred Calhoun worked for Fischl. Fred was a mathematician, and then there was a Sergeant Dykes, who was a supply sergeant, and he was with them at Fort Bliss. And so Dr. Gruner, Hans Gruner, he didn't have anybody working for him, but he was going to leave shortly to go to the Cape. So this was in July of '51, and shortly after that.
Is this on Squirrel Hill?
Yeah, Squirrel Hill, and we were in Building 112, and as I say, people started to get hired, mostly coming from Keesler Air Force Base, and it was Jim Taylor and some other people, and Jim Taylor was hired to also work for Dr. Manteuffel, and we were in the basement floor of Building 112, the north side of the building. And people observed us, and they said we were the most supervised people in the whole place. Manteuffel was down talking to Taylor, and I would listen to him. He said, "Taylor, Taylor, Taylor, I told you this. I told you this many times." And I would chuckle, and then he'd be up at my place, and he'd say, "Mr. Winkler, you have made a mistake." He says, "I too made mistakes," was a young engineer, but you said, "You have made the same mistake 2 times. And so he went back and forth. And then he went off to a meeting somewhere, and he came back all enthusiastic about a 4-beam oscilloscope. And he says, "We must order this thing because we can see what's going on in magnetic amplifiers. We can see all the circuits." So we ordered one, and it came in, and we couldn't stop it from drifting, and I think it had serial number 5, and it was, and so finally we just gave up on it and put it on the shelf. And then one day I was calculating, and I crumbled up the paper and I'd start over again and threw it in the wastebasket, and here came Dr. Manteuffel in, and he got that out of the wastebasket and smoothed it out, and he said, "Mr. Winkler, you are like most Americans, you are so wasteful." I said, what do you mean? He said, "The paper has 2 sides, you know." So I said, it kind of triggered me off, and I said, "Dr. Manteuffel," I said, "you talk about waste." I said, "You bought that oscilloscope up there that cost as much as a Cadillac car, and it's just not used, it's no good." "Oh," he said, "it will be used." And he says, he called Bill Wallace, the instrument repairman. He says, "We urgently need this oscilloscope to be serviced. We urgently need it." But I never got accused for not using both sides of the paper again. Okay, what's next then?
Well, along about then, plans started to come up for Explorer and so forth.
Yeah, well, before we get to that, let me say one other thing. In 51, these Germans wanted to do some teaching, and there were a lot of people with degrees. They wanted to take graduate courses. So there was a meeting set up at the old Butler High School, and some professors came up from Tuscaloosa in physics and math, and some administrators, and the German scientists and the ones that wanted to take courses. We all met at the old Butler High School, and the decision was made to try physics and math. So I took a couple of courses at first. In September of 51, I took a course in rocket engineering from Dr. Thiel, and I took a...
Dolph Thiel.
Yeah, and I took an E&M course from Heusemann. And then in the spring, I took a theoretical physics course from Stuhlinger. And those were kind of interesting times, and I thought it was a good way to spend my time in the Army. Now, I didn't get a very good grade in that rocket engineering. It was advanced thermodynamics, and it was a grade that stayed on my record later on when I wanted to get serious about going after a master's degree. But anyway, I didn't know at the time that I was going to stay here. And that's another interesting thing. When my time came up to finish my Army time, Bob Lindstrom and others organized for companies to come in and interview people and make them offers. And I got several offers at that time, but I thought I'd like to keep doing what I was doing. So I talked with Stuhlinger, and he said he'd like me to stay, and I should ask for GS7. And he says because I'd be working for Taylor, and Taylor's GS9. Yet I knew that these offers I'd gotten from these aerospace companies were more like the GS9 level, so I asked for GS9 and got it. And then Taylor was immediately promoted to 11, so I
everybody won.
Yeah, so I thought I got Taylor a promotion that way. Now this Dr. Munteufel, he was turned down for a 14. That's why he left and went to GE, I used to visit him up at GE, and I got an offer from him up there, and I thought about going up there to work with him, but I knew he wouldn't be around too much longer, and so I decided to stay where I was. And during those 50s, it seemed like it was an exciting place to be. And I remember seeing you in the lab working on Explorer, and you were still in the service at that time. I guess you were in the service a little later than I was.
Just a little bit later.
Yeah,
yes.
so, but I don't know, you were working on that, and I was in that group there, and then we moved to 4487, I believe,
I think we moved to 4487 at about the time that ABMA.
Yeah, ABMA, right.
And the Jupiter program.
Yeah. Yeah, I worked on some things that had to do with controlling Jupiter on the launch pad, and I remember it would turn at the rate of the minute hand on the clock, and I had worked on the control circuit for that, and I was spending quite a bit of time at the Cape at that time. And then along in there too, Dorrance Anderson and I took a course in Boolean algebra taught by Hugh Zena over at the Comp Lab, and we recognized that we could use that to develop the logic to build a static inverter, a power inverter. We had power transistors by that time, and if we switched them in a controlled way, we could build up a stepped wave that would simulate a sine wave. And so we worked on that along with Bert Willis and John Gould, and we got a patent, actually. So, and it was even more than getting a patent. The patent attorney got the experience of having the patent challenged by Westinghouse. Westinghouse had engineers that had something similar, and we set up a court case, and they had a recorder from Birmingham, and all the inventors testified what they had contributed and so forth, and gave evidence. Now I have to say the Westinghouse people had better notebooks than we had. Our notebooks weren't very, they were kind of shoddy. But I was wondering if we would be successful, but we ended up both sides getting patents. And so George Porter, the patent attorney, said that a lot of patent attorneys go through their whole career without having a controversy like he appreciated us going through with that. Let's see.
Well, you got out of the Army then in about what?
52.
52.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
And we're in the civilian role thereafter.
Right, it was, and I went back. I wrote to the power company saying I had accepted a GS9, and I didn't say what the salary was, but I accepted a GS9. I figured they would know what that was, and I said I'd be in at Christmas to talk with them about possibly getting my old job back. And so I called them when I went home at Christmas, and they said that I wanted to talk with the chief engineer, and they said he was pretty well scheduled that day, but I could come in and they'd try to work me in. So I went there, and after about 2 hours, he sent a message out saying that he'd call me that night instead of working me in. It seemed to me like the door was open, and I could hear a lot of joking going on. They couldn't even, it really kind of bothered me that he couldn't even come out and shake my hand. But he called me that night, and he said, what we can offer you is your old pay plus cost of living raises. I said, well, I wanted to talk to you about, I said I wasn't just a foot soldier, I was doing some technical work. And he said, well, that's the best we can do. I said, well, did you see that I was now a GS9? He says, I said, that's quite a bit more than than you're offering. And he said, well, he says you'll be living here at home. He says you got to take that into consideration, and you got to take into consideration that working for a power company is a job for life. And I said, well, I'm going to have to think about all this. It turned out later on that company went bankrupt, that power company. But I decided I was better off down here, and so.
All right. Well, we all moved over to 4487, and what organization were you with at that time? Which division? And so
I was in they called it. It was Jim Taylor was the head of it. Jim Taylor, and it was a senior. It was called a senior branch, I think. It wasn't. It wasn't a division, but we didn't have as many people as a division, so they called it a senior branch. And
of what laboratory at that time?
that was in Astrionics.
Astrionics.
Yeah, that's okay. Dr. Heusemann's laboratory.
Okay, so you were in Astrionics.
Right. And long about 63 or 65, Dr. Heusemann called me in he said there was a fellow from Stanford, Dr. Everett, and he had an experiment that he wanted to, which it turned out to be GPB, but that GPB was just launched about 2 years ago, and so this is how long that was being worked. Anyway, he told us about that experiment, and it was something that was developed by Leonard Schiff, I guess, to prove some small effect predicted by Einstein, and I'm not sure if it's worked or not, but
the results haven't been reported yet.
No, I haven't heard anything, and so I got to working with Rudy Decker over there at Astrionics. He had a small group that kind of a working group to follow the Stanford people, and we went there a few times. And then Rudy went over to Space Sciences Lab to be on Gerhard Heller's staff. And then I noticed in the Marshall Star one day where Rudy had gone to be a division chief, and I think it was Russ Shelton's division. For some reason he left and Rudy got that division. And Rudy was, he was managing with George Bucher the postdoc plan for the whole center. And so I called Rudy and I said, who's doing that now that they had about 15 or 20 postdocs at SSL? And he says, I am. And I said, well, you're a division chief now. He says, that's right, but he says, I said, well, you think Mr. Heller would be interested in me doing that? And he said, I'll talk to him. So he talked to Heller, and Heller called me up, and we went over and we talked, and he said he'd like to have me move over there. But I talked to Taylor, and Taylor said the division chiefs are very, laboratory chiefs are very possessive of their numbers, and he says they wouldn't let you go. So I said, well, can you ask anyway? So he asked Bill Horton, who was the deputy, and Horton said no. I said, well, do you mind if I talk to Brooks Moore? I think he's a personal friend, and so I talked to...
By then, Brooks Moore had replaced Hausman.
Yeah, right. That's right. So I talked to Brooks, and I was looking to become a 15. I was a 14, and so I was looking for a chance to become a 15. And Brooks said he didn't have anything to offer me, but he said he would let me transfer, but if somebody from SSL wanted to transfer to Astrionics, he had an agreement from Mr. Heller that he wouldn't block it. So, that sounded pretty good. So I went over there, but I told Heller that I had gotten a master's degree by this time, and I told Heller I had applied and been accepted to get into a PhD program, and I would be. This was now 71. And I said I'd be gone 2 quarters in 71, early in the year and late in the year. And he said he was delighted to have somebody working on a PhD, so he said he would be glad to accommodate that. And I finished those times, and then in 72 I was working on Heller's staff, and one of the things I pulled together, he had a lot of co-ops. There seemed to be a lot of money at that time for Apollo money, and so we had a lot of co-ops, and he didn't know what the co-ops were doing. He wanted me to organize a presentation from each co-op, so I did that, and then I was doing that, and I was doing the postdocs, and then he wanted to know what involvement everybody had in Skylab and put together a report, which I did that too, and it ended up being a popular publication. But unfortunately, and that was 72 now, and unfortunately he was killed. Heller was killed in an automobile wreck and going to Nashville. So we were without a laboratory director. And that existed for a while, and then Dr. Heusemann moved in there to be laboratory director, and he was there for about a year, I guess. And he moved his staff in with him, Hoberg and some others, and so he had more staff than he wanted, and I believe it was at that time that I moved. Yeah, that was, it might have been a little later. Might have been a little later when you came over, and you moved in some people like Bill Johnson and Siebel, Anyway, I was gradually moved off the staff and became Decker's deputy down in his division, and I was, in addition to the duties that I was doing as the deputy division chief, I was working on a PhD. I had finished my courses, and then there was a number of exams and working on a dissertation and things like that. And so,
in what field were you working on the degree?
I was working on it, and the name of the dissertation was Primary Aberrations for Grazing Incidents.
Oh, okay.
It was a grazing incidents
This was
optics.
Then.
Yeah, grazing incidents optics, and it was. I have to give a lot of credit here to Dietrich Korsch. I don't know if you know Dietrich
Yes.
Korsch. He was very helpful in that whole thing, and so let's see. Another thing that was helpful to me was I was taking courses over here at UAH, and they had a rule that if a course got to be 7 years old, it didn't count anymore. And that was when I was working on my master's degree. And so it looked like I was never going to get a master's degree because I was taking about one course a year, and I was dropping them off as fast as I was taking them. But we had had a summer faculty program, and some of those people from Tuscaloosa were here for the summer, and we used to eat lunch together and everything. And he said, Bill Webb is the one I was thinking about. He said, you ought to get the training people to approve you going down to the campus, take 3 courses, and work on a thesis. And he says, you could wind this whole thing up. And he said, some of these courses that are outdated, you could audit them and do the homework in them and get credit for them. So that sounded like a good idea. That's what I did. So then the PhD lasted a little bit longer, though. That was.
But when did you get it done?
I got it done in 77.
77.
So, and one of the things that was that worried me, and most of these people that get PhDs, they were worried about the math exam, and the math exam was under the jurisdiction of Ainsworth. You ever hear?
I remember Ainsworth.
And I've had courses from Ainsworth, and he was tough. He was a tough. You had to know.
Pure mathematician.
You had to know your stuff, you know, and so when I was down there, I audited several of his courses just to get what I could out of it. And then people told me that when you take that math exam, don't expect to pass it the first time. So a lot of people take it 2 or 3 times. So, but I didn't know whether that was, the way you studied for that math exam. You took old exams that he had issued, and then he never repeated them, but you got a flavor of the toughness of the problems. And usually the exam was 25 problems, and you picked 10, and you had to have 8 right out of the 10 to get to pass. So when I went down there, there was only 20 problems, and I looked down through the list, and I checked the ones I pretty sure I could do, and it only came up to 6. So I was working, and another advice I had gotten was if you don't do it in 3 hours, you just leave. And so after 3 hours, I was the only one in the room, and I was still trying to figure out how to do some of these problems. And Ainsworth said, "You better wind it up." And so I felt like I said, "Dr. Ainsworth, I feel like I've been shortchanged." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, I studied for this program, and every exam had 25 problems, and you only had 20 today. And I said, I knew how to do contour integration, and you didn't ask for any of that. And he says, I overlooked that. So he went back, he says, stay here and I'll go get a couple. So he went and got a couple of problems in contour integration and brought them back, and he had a kind of a smile on his face. He said, try these. And so I recognized that they were long problems, but I started working on them. And one of them especially said, show that this integral is equal to this constant value. And I worked on till about 3:30, and he said, how are you coming? And I said, well, on this one here, I can't see anything wrong in my work, and I said, I can't make it equal that constant value that I'm supposed to show. And he says, let me see. And he went over the board and made some kind of, he says, I must have copied that down wrong. And boy, I was kind of beat. So he says, you can call the university in Huntsville on Monday morning. This was a Friday. He said, Monday morning and see if you pass. So I called Monday morning and I had passed. So that was, I was really drained after that.
Well, then you were a fresh PhD and in the space sciences lab. What jobs did you work on?
Well, it wasn't long after I got that Kingsbury called me and said, he says, I'd like you to work with Dr. Speer. And he was working on the space telescope. He was the manager of the Space Telescope, and his chief engineer was Gene Oliver. And he says, Dr. Speer wants somebody to keep up with the instruments, science instruments. They're responsibility of Goddard, but Speer wants to have his own man involved, and
needs to understand them.
And so yeah, understand them and go to the meetings, and Goddard wouldn't accept anybody from the project, so I was from outside the project and independent, and so they accepted me, and I got involved with that, and that was quite interesting, interfacing with PIs and contractors and so forth, and I did that through until the Space Telescope was launched.
So that was a long process. How many years was that?
Oh, I don't know how many years that was. It's probably about 7 or 8 years, I guess.
It was a long, hard battle to get the Space Telescope ready. Yeah,
that was. But those, I really enjoyed working with people like, I can't remember the fellow's name at JPL, or Caltech, I guess it was, Jim Westfall. Westfall, he had the wide field camera. That was.
Yeah.
And then there was some others. There was Brandt at Goddard. He was a PI, and Bless.
Jack Brandt, I think.
Yeah, and Bless from Wisconsin. He was the high-speed photometer guy. And so then, anyway, that finally went, and then I switched over to AXAF, which was in Phase B, and worked with Carol Daly and Max Rosenthal, and I'm not sure if when it was in Phase B, it was headed up by I can't remember his name now, but anyway, it advanced to become a full-blown project under Wojtalik. I think he was
Fred Wojtalik.
Yeah, Fred Wojtalik. So I was involved again with instruments, science instruments. They were different, and they had different PIs and so forth. And one of the PIs was from Holland, and we were talking one time, and in the discussion we came up with what names mean, and he said he once knew somebody named Manteuffel. He said that means man devil. He said he was a devil. And I says I worked with a Manteuffel one time, and he said, well, this fellow is quite a bit. I said he must be in his 70s or more by now. He said, well, this fellow is more like around 40. I said, well, that must be his son. I said, was it I mentioned the name, and he said, yeah, that was him. And I remember that Dr. Manteuffel was worried about his son because he wanted his son to be an electrical engineer like him, and he didn't do well. He failed some courses, and he said, I don't want to be an electrical engineer. I want to be a civil engineer. So he went along with him becoming a civil engineer, and I guess he was successful as a civil engineer because this fellow from Holland knew him, and I enjoyed my career out there, and that was probably with the XF that became known as Chandra. That was probably the most significant work I did.
Well, that was another long ordeal.
It was, yeah.
How many years did that go on?
Oh, I'm not sure when they launched it. I think I was retired when they launched it. I retired in '97. At 46 years of government service to go ahead with, go along with 10 years at the power company. So I was working, I was gainfully employed. I'm kind of proud of this. From the age 14, was getting a paycheck or getting some kind of value for my time until I retired in '97, age 69. So, yeah.
Well, the AXEF, or Chandra as it's now called, was remarkably successful.
Oh,
as far
yeah,
as
yes,
this.
right.
So you helped the PIs get all their instruments ready for that very challenging mission.
Right, and we especially enjoyed working with Martin Weisskopf, and
So you were retired then in '97?
'97, yeah.
What have you been doing since then?
Well, it's you know, it's we got 2 grandchildren, and it turned out that my daughter and her husband, in order to have a good middle-class living, they both had to work, you know. So I spent a lot of time transporting them around after school to different things, like my granddaughter was taking violin for a while. She's since quit. But anyway, they're all activities. But I found myself kind of sitting and waiting a lot. So I said, I can't do this. I've always wanted to know about all the U.S. presidents. So I started a project to learn about all these presidents, and I said that's a good review of American history. So some of the presidents I couldn't name at one time, but now I can name them all in order. If somebody asked me, I could name them all in order.
We I guess don't need that.
No. But
well, are there any thoughts you'd like to leave for the coming generation that's trying to redo a lot of the things that you did? Any words of wisdom you'd like to leave for the record?
Well, one time Fred Votalic asked me to pinch hit for him to talk to the Instrument Society down in Birmingham. He says, take a trip down there and take your wife, and he says, enjoy a weekend. And I was to tell about the Space Telescope. And so I did that, and there were a lot of people over there from the university in Tuscaloosa, and I told them at the end of that meeting, I said, I recommend that 3 things. I said, I recommend you, in addition to your technical work, computers are now the way to input everything. You need to be a typist. You ought to take typing, you ought to take speed reading, and you ought to take foreign language. And so they said, which foreign language? And well, this was about 20 years ago, I guess. And so then I wasn't quite ready to tell them which language, but I said, well, I think Spanish would be a good language. I said, I know that French and German would be probably better technically, but I said I just took a trip down to Florida, and I I couldn't even talk with the people down there. I said, the Spanish language is going to be more and more important. I said, that's what I would say. And so I think those three things are still valid. To be able to read with comprehension in a fast way, and to be able to run a keyboard and maybe learn Spanish.
Well, those are three interesting final thoughts. Thank you very much.
Well, it's a pleasure. I enjoyed it.